If you cast your minds back to Animus, which remains one of my personal favourites that we've done so far, you'll recall that the bulk of the source material came from a book on the destruction of Dresden, which is called The Fire and the Darkness, by an author named Sinclair Mackay. Well, Mr. Mackay was also unwittingly the inspiration for this episode, Gehenna, in that he included Foulness Island as one of the subjects in his subsequent publication, Secret Britain. In that book, Secret Britain, he travels across the UK and shines a light on the various military sites and remote locations that contributed towards the Allied victory in World War II. And these are sites that, as a reader, you're a lot less likely to be aware of. I mean, sure, you're going to have heard of the events that took place at Bletchley Park. I'd be surprised if anybody who watches the channel hasn't. But I doubt you've heard about the Drakelow tunnels in Kidderminster. That's where, close to where Rich from Bedtime Stories lives, and also close to where I used to live as well, because we were pretty much neighbours. You're also a lot less likely to have heard about the massive underground fuel storage tanks up at Inchindown near Invergordon. Spoiler alert, there's going to be a future episode which is set at least one of those two locations, but I ain't going to tell you which one. As I've alluded to, Foulness Island is a very real place. It's not one I've made up. It's one that Sinclair Mackay covers in his book, and it's got a very tangible link to the Allied victory in World War II. But as I've done with previous stories, I've layered a great deal of poetic license on top of that. The island forms part of a wider military facility called Shoeburyness, and the land there has been under the control of the MOD since 1849. The majority of the land within the base perimeter has historically been used by the Army and the Navy in order to test different types of artillery and ordnance. So Royal Naval ships with new turrets on them would sail past the island. There would be targets set up on the land and they would open fire on them. And at the same time, coastal defence batteries built to keep away first the French and the Germans would be constructed on the island, and then they'd be used to fire at towed naval targets that went past. During World War II specifically, a series of mock-ups were created on the island of the German Atlantic wall defences in France, and engineers experimented with various explosive types such as Bangalore torpedoes to try and breach those coastal defence walls. Whilst the creation of the fictional village of Hunchester and the poison gas tanks in it are a complete fabrication, Foulness and Shoeburyness do hold a somewhat infamous place in British military history. Following the Cold War, there was a programme at Foulness known as Operation Hurricane, and that saw the various components of Britain's first atomic bomb being assembled at the site. 1952, once that device was finished, it was then shipped out of Laboratory X6 at Foulness to the Montebello Island chain, northwest of Australia, where Britain's first atomic bomb was then detonated 8 weeks later. I had a query not long after Gehenna was published in the comments, asking me if the inspiration for the story came from a particular Doctor Who episode, which was named Silence in the Library. Full disclosure, I'm a pretty solid Whovian, and I love that particular episode, but it isn't the inspiration for Gehenna. Sorry, folks. It does open the doorway for people watching this video to comment on who their favourite Doctor Who actor is and why. My answers, because I've got you, in old money, Tom Baker, and in new money, Peter Capaldi, which I'm guessing kind of puts me in a bit of a minority, but that's a place I've always been comfortable with. The inspiration for Gehenna actually arises from a completely different question, which somebody recently posed to me in our Discord server. I pinned the link to the Discord server in the comments of each video. You're more than welcome to come and join us there. A lot of pictures of squirrels, very random. But the question that was asked was, what comics did I read growing up as a kid? Because it's obvious that I read comics because I'm quite emotionally damaged now. From a Marvel point of view, the original Civil War storyline, which is way better than the MCU version, pretty much hooked me on the Punisher. From a DC point of view, Batman all day long. Favourite Batman story being the Court of the Owls series. But my love of comics goes way back beyond Marvel and DC, and it goes to a British publication called 2000 AD. My dad paid for a subscription for me to read 2000 AD for about a decade. I'd argue it's the best thing he's ever done for me. And if you're not familiar with 2000 AD, that's where the character Judge Dredd comes from. Judge Dredd is typical of many 2000 AD characters in that they were created during the 80s and 90s, and they were designed to parody by the creators the aspects of British and American society that they disliked, that they hated. They didn't like American foreign policy, going invading other countries. They didn't like consumerism and that industry. A lot of their more satirical takes on society during the 80s and 90s created these characters in 2000 AD. And one of the other big names alongside Judge Dredd was a character named Rogue Trooper. So Rogue Trooper, the basic storyline is that there's another Cold War in the future, but it doesn't play out on Earth. It plays out in the solar system. And in particular, one planet named New Earth, where both sides are desperate to achieve domination because of the natural resources. Half the combatants are a northern faction known as the Nauts, and they're depicted as quite European, quite Germanic in appearance. And then the other half, the goodies, so to speak, are known as the South, as the Southern Coalition, and they're very American in the way they present. Rogue Trooper, is one of 4 genetic infantrymen that the South have created as an experiment. He's impervious to poison gas. He's resistant to bullets and blades. And he and his 3 colleagues are betrayed by a rogue general in the South, and his 3 mates are killed. But he manages to save their consciousnesses in biochips, and he places those into his equipment. So he's got one of his mates in his rifle, well, his mate's consciousness anyway. I'm not explaining this very well, am I? One in his backpack and one in his helmet, and they can talk to each other, and the individual pieces of equipment can act independently of him to help him survive battles. And the basic story arc is he tries to cross this planet completely consumed by war and war zones to track down the general who betrayed him and his friends. And I suppose if you think of it back in like a sort of 90s animated series kind of way, his goal is to try and bring his mates back to life, to get their consciousnesses put into new bodies. And sometimes he's successful and sometimes he isn't. But Rogue is the thing that links it all together. The shtick for one of these stories, and I did reread it recently, was that at one period he's trying to cross a valley that is going completely corrupted by flesh-eating gas. Because of his DNA makeup, he's resistant to the gas, so he's walking through these fogs of toxic fumes, and he takes on a Naut unit that ambushes him. They're obviously not able to survive the gas. They're wearing protective suits, and while they're fighting him, every time he pierces their suit, their flesh is immediately dissolved, and there's just a suit with a skeleton in it that drops down onto the floor. And it was the imagery, the art from that really led to Gehenna being created. I'd massively recommend 2000 AD and Judge Dredd to anybody who hasn't read them. There was a publishing company called Hachette who released a load of compilation collections from them, which are probably quite cheap to find on the internet now. There's also a Rogue Trooper movie in production, which is going to be directed by Duncan Jones, who I believe is David Bowie's son. It's going to have Hayley Atwell in it and Matt Berry. I love Matt Berry. And that is due for release at some point next year in 2025. You heard it here first, folks. When I came up with the idea for Gehenna, the basic conceit would be that you've got these two recurring strands through the storylines. One is Armitage and one is Shepherd. And I would combine them both into one team. It had been building to that. It was going to happen. But I didn't want it to be cliche. I didn't want this to be Lethal Weapon, comic book style, buddy mission team up. I'd resolved that the stage was too small for both characters. We've got to lose one. And as soon as I started writing the script, I'd figured out that one of them would get wounded in the gas and sacrifice themselves for the other. I didn't know who. In fact, halfway through the script, I still didn't know who. But in the end, I decided to make Shepherd a bit more of an arsehole than he'd been. Largely as a result of the fact that he'd run all these missions for the British Army and he'd lost loads of men while he was doing it. But at the end of the day, he'd redeem himself to save Armitage. And in doing so, he'd probably mess Armitage up a little bit. I'm not saying Armitage isn't already messed up, but more than he is now. In terms of the potential love triangle that I tease, I don't intend to go into that. Sometimes it's nice just to tease something rather than fully reveal it. Everyone's entitled to a private life, Belle and Amos included, but I do think that Shepard's death will potentially push them apart. Then that's what you'd expect in war, isn't it really? There is a minor issue some of you might have noticed in that in some of the testimonials set after 1942, Shepard is still referred to. That isn't a mistake on my part. It's certainly not a deliberate mistake on my part. But don't worry, there is a workaround. There's going to be a future testimonial addressing how we work around that. And I promise it doesn't involve reanimating his cold, dead corpse using a spell or an alien device. It's simpler than that. I hope you won't hate it. Frankly, I don't care if you do. In addition to that testimonial, there are a couple of other things that I'm going to try and get across the line before the break of the new year, because it is nearly December. One is another factual episode, and that will be on the death of the German tank case Michael Wittmann, and a little bit of controversy around who actually killed him. The other is going to be another full-length episode. I haven't done many of late. Full disclosure, some of that is money, some of that is time. But I have been working on one in the background, which the artwork is nearly finished for, and it's got a very nautical theme. I might not get another production video out before the end of the year. If I don't, I suppose this is my opportunity to say thank you all again. I hope the festive season is kind to each and every one of you, and I hope you all have a great year moving forwards. And I will try and talk to you before that point. Take care, folks.